Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today we're gonna have a short and spicy, actually probably not that spicy, review of a series that I read over the last half year. And that series is Imriel's Trilogy, which is the second trilogy within the Kushiel's Legacy universe, which currently consists of 3 trilogies, possibly soon 4. So this is the second one of the trilogies. Usually whenever I talked about any of these books in my other videos, I didn't talk about what they were about because it's kind of slightly spoilery in terms of what happens in the first trilogy. However, I assume that if you click on this video, you have read Phaedra's trilogy, so I won't hold back in this one when it comes to spoilers for Phaedra's trilogy. So if you haven't read it yet, please do not. Anyway, Imriel's Trilogy, as the name suggests, is about Imriel, who of course is the son of Terdange's biggest traitor. I always forget if it's Melisandre or Melisande, one or the other, and who is also the foster son of Jocelyn and Phaedra, our heroes from the first trilogy. And this series kind of follows Imriel as he comes into his own as a noble of Terdange, as a member of the royal household, and also as the son of one of the biggest traitors in his home country's history, but also as the foster son of the biggest heroes of his home country. And then also it handles him dealing with the trauma of what he went through in the last book of Phaedra's trilogy, because of course he was sold as a slave and sexually abused in that one when he was like 11 years old, I think. So yeah, there's a lot there. And so let's get into my thoughts on this series. First, which of the books did I like the most? It was quite similar actually with this trilogy as well as Phaedra's trilogy, because the first book definitely was my favorite of the 3, and the last book definitely was my least favorite of the 3, which tended to be the same case with Phaedra's trilogy. In terms of pacing overall of the single books, I actually think this series is slightly better. However, where the first series definitely shines is in terms of relationships, but I will get to that still. So I will in this video more so talk about the single elements of the series rather than, you know, split it into negatives and positives. So let's get started with the thing that Jacqueline Carey is definitely the best at, which is the sexual elements in her series. Because obviously the intention of the first series was to create a world where sexuality and sensuality is as prevalent within this fantasy world as violence usually is within fantasy, and to kind of have commentary on how normalized we are, or not normalized, but how desensitized we are towards violence in fantasy stories, where we're a lot more prude when it comes to sexuality. And that's how Terdange was created, this country where love as thou wilt is the highest precept, and where sex is something sacred and not something that, you know, people are scared of, and it's something very normalized and very religious. And so in this series you now have a main character who is incredibly traumatized. Like, he is so traumatized, and he comes from a line from a family that usually is more towards the sadism or sadist side in regards to how they enjoy their sexual stuff. And so now you have this character who first of all has to come to terms with himself as a sexual being, with having all this trauma, but also with, you know, feeling like he wants to hurt others, and with coming to terms how there's a difference between just terrorizing someone sexually and also providing, you know, sexual release, let's put it like that, but in a more sadomasochistic way. And so all of those elements are so well done within the series, and when it comes to sexuality, really, that's where the series shines. Also, Imriel's bisexuality is very interesting within the series as well, because there's multiple instances where he does feel drawn to men as well, but he never really acts on it because most of his sexual trauma is surrounded by being with men or being used by men. So he has a way harder time letting himself be sexual with men than with women, and obviously in the end he falls in love with a woman, so it then plays less of a role later on. Although I have to say that surrounding that specific trauma, there is a scene in the third book where I am not particularly a fan with how that was handled. Can't go into it because of spoilers, but yeah, aside from that, I just trust Jacqueline Carey in that regard with almost everything, handling trauma and so on. And also concerning the trauma and concerning Imriel working through this within the different books, it's what makes the series so interesting to me, actually. This first book, a lot of people say nothing is really happening, and outwardly that is quite true. There's like single plot points, but the plot arc or the story arc doesn't hinge on what outwardly happens within the plot. So it can seem like the pacing is kind of random of this book, and you know, there's a climax happening here, and now something is happening here, and now there's something slightly bigger happening here. But that's because, generally speaking, actually with the first two books, not so much the third one, I will talk about the third one separately. Generally speaking, with the first two books, the way the story arc is built is by what happens within Imriel internally, which works really well because this is told in first-person perspective. And so, yeah, it can seem like the pacing of the story is a little bit odd when you just look at what is happening plot-wise. But when you look at what is happening within the story, or not within the story, but within Imriel, then suddenly the pacing of the story makes a lot more sense. And so within this first book, we mostly come to terms with Imriel as, you know, who he is in terms of who he is to the realm. And then within the second book, we follow Imriel as he comes to terms with who he is himself and who he allows himself to be for himself, etc. It's kind of hard to explain. So yeah, just absolutely adored the first two books. The third book in that regard is kind of interesting because Imriel in a way is not the main character of this first book. It's Sidonie who is the love interest of Imriel. She is really who everything is all about, and who has to take the actions to move the plot forward and to save people, etc. Imriel more so is just the supporting character who helps her get to where she needs to be, which makes for a slightly unsatisfying read, or at least made for a slightly unsatisfying read while I read it. But after I realized what was going on afterwards, I actually found it really quite interesting. I just love Jacqueline Carey in general for all of these things, because she does use a lot of very traditional fantasy tropes and fantasy structures, but she always twists and subverts them slightly. And sometimes it can take time to realize what exactly she does, but sometimes it's also pretty obvious. In terms of the romance, I think this one isn't as good as the original trilogy, so Phaedra's trilogy, and there's a very specific reason for that. Within Phaedra's trilogy, while we are also looking at everything from Phaedra's point of view, so everything is first-person perspective, we are introduced to Jocelyn quite early on, and Jocelyn plays a very, very important part within Phaedra's story from almost the very beginning, from the point that he's introduced. And while there are parts in the books where they are parted or not together, those parts often are a lot of what moves the relationship forwards. For this series, I can't go into too much detail because that would be spoilers, but the love interest, I kind of mentioned it already, Sidonie, but it's very obvious that Sidone is gonna be the main love interest. She is introduced quite early, and she appears every now and again in the first book. She also appears every now and again in the second book. However, she only really plays a role in the third book. And so you have this guy who is in love with this girl. However, you're not really introduced to the girl as a character, and so it just makes it sometimes hard to feel with Imriel past just feeling for him as a character, to really care about this relationship and why do we want the two of them together, because we don't see the two of them together a lot. So yeah, that's why I kind of didn't like the romance in this one a lot. However, everything else, to be honest, like the first trilogy also was very introspective. So Phaedra's trilogy also is very introspective in how it's written. However, I find it very interesting how the female main character is the one who does the more traditionally heroic things a lot of the times, and who is much more on a journey of saving her country, whether the journeys that Imriel goes on and the stuff that he has to do are far more to do with his personal growth and his personal journey. He only really becomes a savior for the country in the third book. The first two books are... No, these are the first two books. The first two books are all about Imriel's personal journey, and if he goes out and does something traditional fantasy hero type shit, it's still to further his own personal journey, and that's what I absolutely love. Also, there's something that I really want to talk about in the series, but I can't talk about it because it's a really fucking massive spoiler for it, the second book, so I can't talk about it. But yeah, I really adore Jacqueline Carey's writing. There's some of the other problems that, you know, she generally still has, although a little bit less because of where we travel within the second book compared to the first book. You know, there are some typically early 2000s fantasy orientalist tropes within this series, but since we mostly spend time within Western inspired stuff, it's not as much of an issue within this one than within the first series. And I'm gonna be very excited how it looks within the third series, because I think in the third one we're going to the Americas as well as to the Far East, so yeah. But anyway, if you have read this trilogy, tell me in the comments down below what were your thoughts on it. If you have read the first series, are you interested in picking up the second series? I know, generally speaking, the second series isn't as loved as the first one, but to be honest, while I do think that it lacks in certain regards, mostly in the romance section, I think Imriel is every bit as much of a lovable main character as Phaedra is. And so yeah, tell me in the comments down below all of your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media as well as to my book club are linked down below, so go and check those out, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!